Hi, folks. Today I thought I'd talk a little bit about a key number that tells you how fast you're going to be able to race, and that is your pace at lactate threshold. Pace at lactate threshold. So, most people have heard about lactate threshold, and you might have also heard lactate and lactic acid, and I'm going to throw in hydrogen ions, which you may or may not have heard. So, people think it's the lactate or the lactic acid that causes them to sometimes bonk because they've got too much of that. It's actually the hydrogen ions that are the issue. Lactate itself, you produce it all the time. People think it's only when you're running faster. Even when you're running slow, you're producing it. You're just producing it in fairly small amounts. And actually, your body uses it as fuel. It burns it off fairly quickly. But there's a point where you're producing more than your body can burn off. And these hydrogen ions that come along with it are the ones that are associated with fatiguing you. So it's really, how fast or what's your pace at the hydrogen ion threshold or whatever that would be. So let's talk a little bit more about what is lactate threshold. How do you know what yours is? How do you improve it? So lactate threshold is you can hold that pace for roughly an hour rested. And I wrote rested there in a different color because that doesn't mean during a week of hard training that you got to be able to go out and run for an hour at a hard pace. That here's where my lactate threshold is. This is on rested legs. Generally speaking, you're never going to do lactate work for an hour anyway. But generally speaking, it's a pace you can hold for about an hour on rested legs. So for some people, that's a 10K. For other people, it's going to be less than a 10K. If you're an elite, it's probably your half marathon pace because they're doing a half marathon in an hour and a minute or something like that. So how would you know what your lactate threshold is? Well, there's several ways that you can determine that. One, you can look at race times. That's probably the most common for all of us. If you take your 5K pace, say it's 7 minutes, add 25 to 30 seconds to that, your lactate threshold's probably about 725 or 730. You can also go to one of the various calculators out there, McRun, VDOT, etc., plug in race times. It will also estimate for you what your lactate threshold is. Now, if you're a fan of heart rate, your lactate threshold is generally going to be 88 to 90% of whatever your max heart rate is. So if your max heart rate is 200, you multiply by 88% and 90%, you will get the range where your heart rate is going to be at your lactate threshold. If you're looking at effort, that effort is probably what's known as sentences. That means when you're running, you can talk, but you'd prefer not to talk. And if you can talk, you can maybe get out a sentence before you've got to gasp for breath. If you have to get a gasp for breath before you can get a sentence out, that effort is too hard. You're probably not there. On the other hand, when you're conversational, it's not there. So look for that effort to be a sentence effort. Now, the real tried and true way, because all those, frankly, are just kind of guesses as to where it is. They're fairly close guesses, but you really determine it's a blood test. You prick your finger while you're doing some running, typically on a treadmill, and they're measuring something, and it gets that. You can buy consumer testers now. I think they're like $250 or something. I mean, if you really want to know where your lactate threshold is, you can get one of these devices for $250, $300, $400, whatever it is, and somehow they do a self-test. I think you'd have to do that while you're running and kind of know where your lactate threshold is. But suffice to say, lactate threshold is important. I think if you estimate it with your race times or that effort, heart rate, whatever, you're going to be close enough. So how do you improve it? Generally speaking, the bread and butter are tempo runs. Now, this gets to be confusing because there are many terms in running that have multiple meanings to people. For a lot of people, a tempo run means a run at your lactate threshold pace. Other people use tempo runs to refer to any sustained running that's faster than your goal race pace. So if say that your lactate threshold is 7 minutes, and let's say you're training for a marathon, that marathon time is 8 minutes, and you're out there running 7:30-minute miles for 6. A lot of people will call that a tempo run, and that's perfectly fine, but that's not a lactate threshold run, so tempo can be confusing. So when you see tempo run, just realize it doesn't always mean it's a lactate threshold run. But the three most common runs are going to be the tempo runs, which I mentioned, tempo intervals, and cruise intervals. Tempo intervals or cruise intervals are really close. Tempo intervals are a little bit more popularized by Greg McMillan. Cruise intervals are a little bit more popularized by Jack Daniels. They're kind of the same thing. But the tempo run is going to be a steady run of some sort, and of course the intervals are going to be a little bit of a broken run. If you're doing a tempo run, they are typically 20 to 30 minutes of running at that pace. Now, I underline 20 because it's far more common to be 20 than 30. People sometimes, we all think more is better. Well, more isn't necessarily better. Now, if you're extremely fit, there's some people that are going to be running more towards the 30 minutes, but for most people, 20 minutes is plenty of time for a tempo run. If you're doing the intervals, you're usually looking at 30 to 40 minutes of combined work. You don't count the rest periods in there. So if you were doing, to make my math easy, say 4x1 mile at 10 minutes. If 10 minutes was your lactate threshold, those 4x1 mile would add up to the 40 minutes. Again, most people are only going to get about 30 minutes of combined work in that. Some people are going to get closer to 40, but most are going to get about 30 minutes of combined work. Generally speaking, when you're doing the intervals, you are going to run those just a little bit faster than you would a tempo run. So if your tempo or your lactate threshold was 7 minutes, then a tempo run might be, say, 3 miles at a 7-minute pace, 21 minutes. That's right in that window. But if you were doing the intervals, it might be, say, 3x1 mile, or excuse me, 4x1 mile at 6:55 or 6:50. Some of the charts will tell you that, but they're typically a little bit faster. There's a place for both. A lot of times we use the intervals to kind of get ready for more sustained tempo running. Also, the intervals, because you're faster, kind of flood you a little bit more to get your body a little bit more accustomed to a sudden onset of lactic acid, and so they can deal with the lactate and, of course, those hydrogen ions. Final thing, typically you do a tempo run once a week. You don't have to do them every week. There's no run that we have to do every week, but it's most common to see it weekly, and generally it's not going to be more than about 10% total of your miles. So you got a couple guidelines there. If it's a straight run, likely not more than 20, maybe 30 minutes, but probably also not more than about 10% of your miles. So that's a little bit about your pace at lactate threshold. It is a key determiner in how fast you're going to race and a big thing you want to work on in your training.